The whip came down before the town remembered how to breathe. 55 years old, on her knees in the red dust of Main Street, hands bound, back bleeding, and not one soul in Sable Ridge moved to stop it. They watched from their porches, from behind their shutters, from the safety of silence that Silas Drummond had spent 2 years building, one mortgage, one threat, one closed door at a time. Then a voice cut through the afternoon heat from the far end of the street. 2 words, a young woman, a blue roan, a hand resting near a holster with the patience of someone who had already decided. Nobody in that town knew her name. By sunset, they would never forget it. And Drummond, standing in his black coat with his gold watch chain, catching the noonlight, looked at her for the first time, and smiled. He should not have smiled. The whip came down before the town remembered how to breathe. That was the thing about Sable Ridge in the autumn of 1882. It had forgotten how to breathe, how to speak, how to do anything except watch from behind shuttered windows and half-latched doors while the worst thing imaginable happened in plain daylight on Main Street. And nobody, not one single soul, stepped off the boardwalk to stop it. The sound of leather cracking against a woman's back traveled the full length of the street, past the general store, past the barber, past the assay office, with its faded painted letters peeling in the Colorado heat. It traveled into every doorway and settled there like smoke, like something that would take years to clear. Nora Calloway was on her knees in the red dust, 55 years old and on her knees. Her dark work skirt had gone the color of the earth beneath her. Her white linen blouse, cuffed to the wrist and buttoned to the collarbone, the way she'd worn it every morning for 30 years, had pulled loose from one shoulder when Rex Vane's men dragged her off her horse. Her silver hair, always knotted tight at the base of her neck, hung in pieces across her jaw. Her wrists were bound behind her with the same rough hemp rope ranchers used to hobble livestock. She was not crying. Her jaw was set so hard the tendons in her neck stood out like fence wire under tension. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere past the hitching post, past the street, past all of it. Deputy Rex Vane rolled the long leather whip back over his shoulder. Again, Silas Drummond said. He said it the way a man orders coffee, flat, unremarkable. Drummond was standing on the boardwalk in front of the land office in his black 3-piece wool suit, the gold watch chain catching the noon light, one thumb hooked in his vest pocket. He hadn't broken a sweat. He was watching Nora Calloway kneel in the dirt with the mild interest of a man observing weather he'd already predicted. Vane drew his arm back. The crowd on both boardwalks did not move. 40, maybe 50 people. Ranchers and shopkeepers, and the men who worked the stamp mills up on the ridge. Women in their working dresses and bonnets. The barber still holding his razor. The blacksmith with his leather apron. Every single one of them watching. Every single one of them doing exactly nothing. That was when the voice came from the south end of Main Street. Drop it. 2 words. Female, young, flat as hammered tin. Vane's arm stopped in mid-swing. Every head on that street turned south, because that voice had not asked. It had stated. There is a particular quality to a voice that has already made its decision before the words come out, and this one had it in abundance. It came from a young woman sitting completely still on the back of a blue roan mare at the far edge of town. She hadn't ridden in. She'd simply been there, the way something becomes visible when the light shifts. Brown duster coat, long past the knee, powdered pale with trail dust, a dark flannel shirt buttoned to the throat, denim heavy enough to stand on its own, boots worn to the shape of her feet, spurs plain iron. Her hat brim cut a straight shadow across her eyes. Her right hand rested near the holster on her hip, resting, not reaching, just resting. Wren Daly was 24 years old, and she had been in Sable Ridge for 3 days, and not one person on that street knew her name yet. That was about to change. Vane lowered the whip a half-inch, not all the way. A man like Vane didn't lower anything all the way on the first ask. He turned his head toward the end of the street and let out a short, contemptuous sound. "Mind your business, girl. This is a legal matter." Wren's hand didn't move from where it rested. Neither did she. The roan shifted its weight. Wren didn't shift anything. The rope on her wrists. Her voice carried clean down the street. Didn't need to be louder. The silence was doing most of the work. Cut it, now. Drummond turned from the boardwalk and looked at the young woman for the first time. Unhurried. The way a man looks at a fence post that has appeared where he didn't expect one. Then he smiled, and the smile was worse than what had come before it. "Somebody," he said to no one in particular, "remove the girl from my street." Two of Drummond's hired men pushed off the wall of the land office and started walking south. Wren Daly clicked her tongue once. The roan walked forward. That was part one of how Sable Ridge got its breath back. But to understand what happened on that street in the autumn of 1882, you had to go back 48 hours, because nothing that happens in a single afternoon is actually born in that afternoon. It's born weeks earlier, in a kitchen, at a table, over a piece of paper that should never have existed. Frank Calloway died on a Wednesday. He died the way strong men sometimes do, without warning, without ceremony, without the decency of a long illness that might have allowed for preparation. He was out checking the north fence line of the Calloway ranch at 9:30 in the morning, and by the time his horse came back riderless at noon, he had been gone for 2 hours. The hand who found him said Frank looked like he'd simply decided to lie down in the grass beside the fence post he'd been fixing. Peaceful, which was the wrong word, but people reached for it anyway, because the right words were too blunt to say out loud to a widow. Nora did not collapse. She did not take to her bed. She sat in the kitchen chair for a while, long enough for the coffee to go completely cold, and then she stood up and went to find Pete Garner, her foreman of 11 years, and told him what needed to be done with the cattle before nightfall, she cried once. That night, with the lamp out and the door closed. By morning she had folded it back up and put it somewhere interior, and she came out to start the stove, and Pete didn't say anything, and that was the correct response. The knock on the front door came before the coffee was ready on Friday morning. Nora knew who it was before she opened it, not because she had any reason to expect Silas Drummond specifically, but because 30 years on the frontier teaches you to recognize the sound of trouble knocking. It has a particular cadence. Drummond knocked the way he did everything, with the weight of a man who already owns the thing on the other side of the door. He was not alone. He had a younger man with him, someone Nora didn't recognize, carrying a leather satchel. Drummond himself was already dressed for business at 7 in the morning, the black wool vest, the watch chain, the polished boots. He stepped into her kitchen without being invited. His boots tracked red mud across her clean pine floor. "Condolences on your loss, Mrs. Calloway." He set a folded stack of papers on her kitchen table. "I'll come to the point. Your late husband borrowed a sum of money from me 18 months ago. The note is now due." Nora looked at the papers on her table. She did not touch them yet. Frank never borrowed money from anyone in his life. The signature on that document says otherwise. Drummond's tone remained conversational. $3,800. You have 72 hours to make payment in full. After which point, the Calloway Ranch, including all structures, livestock, and water rights, reverts to my possession as collateral. The young man with the satchel was writing something down, not looking at Nora. She picked up the papers. "Read them, all of them." Slowly, Frank's signature was at the bottom of the first page, and she studied it for a full 30 seconds before she set the papers back down on the table. Frank Calloway had the most deliberate, careful handwriting of any man she had ever known. She had 30 years of his letters, his ledger entries, his notes left on the kitchen table in the morning. She knew his hand the way she knew his face. The signature on Drummond's paper was a copy of his signature made by someone who had seen it once or twice and done their best. The pen pressure was wrong. The loop on the capital C was wrong. The entire thing was slightly too large, like something traced through paper that had shifted. "Get out of my house," Nora said. Drummond smiled, the same smile he would use on Main Street 2 days later. 72 hours, Mrs. Calloway. He collected his hat from where he'd placed it on her counter without asking. "I'll have my men come for the papers Friday noon." He left the mud on her floor. Nora stood in her kitchen for 4 minutes. Then she untied her apron, hung it on its hook, put on her work boots, her wide-brimmed cloth hat, tied her thin leather work apron to her saddle for later, and rode into Sable Ridge. The bank was her first stop. Everett Cross, the banker, was a thin man who had worked for Drummond's interests for long enough that he'd stopped distinguishing between them and his own. He looked at the papers Nora laid on his counter and handed them back before she'd finished explaining. "The bank recognizes this obligation, Mrs. Calloway. I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do." He was sorry. He said it to her, departing back. She went to the Fowler farm next. Jim Bowden, she would correct that. Jim Bowden's farm. Jim had been Frank's friend since before Nora arrived in Colorado territory. They had helped each other through 3 bad winters. Frank had lent Jim money in 1,878 without paperwork, without interest, without a word about when it came back. Jim Bowden opened his door 8 inches and kept his shoulder against the frame. His face did something complicated. "Nora, I can't. Drummond's got the mortgage on this place if I stand up for you. He didn't finish it, he didn't have to. I'm sorry." The door closed. Nora stood on the Bowden porch for a moment, looking at the closed door. Then she walked back to her horse. Sheriff Cord Hale was in his office with his boots on his desk when Nora pushed through the door. He was a large man running to softness, wearing his vest with the copper badge that had once meant something before Drummond got to him. He looked up at Nora, at the papers she put on his desk, and he looked back at her. He did not move his boots. "Drummond's a landowner and a taxpayer in this county, Mrs. Calloway. The note's got your husband's signature on it. Court would hold it valid." He picked his thumbnail with the point of a folding knife. "Pay your debts or don't. It's not a matter for my office." Nora picked the papers up off his desk. "How much does he pay you?" Hale's face went careful. "You want to be real thoughtful about what you say next." She walked out. She tried the cattle buyers next. 3 of them, men who'd bought Calloway stock for years and knew the quality. All 3 had already heard from Drummond. 2 refused to speak to her at all. The third, a man named Abe Pickett who ran the auction yard, at least had the decency to look ashamed. "He'll pull every contract I got if I touch your stock, Nora. I got 12 men working for me." He spread his hands on his desk. "I can't." By mid-afternoon she had been turned away from every door she'd knocked on. The system in Sable Ridge had not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Drummond had not simply bought influence, he had bought the entire architecture of consequence. So that there was no appeal that didn't run through him, no authority that didn't owe him something. Nora rode back toward town with one stop remaining. The Land Records office. Not because she expected to find rescue there, because she needed to understand the shape of what she was dealing with. 30 years on the frontier had taught her that before you fight something, you look at it directly. You don't look away. You find its edges. The land records were public documents. The clerk, a young man who looked guilty about being present, led her into the filing room and retreated to his desk. She pulled the files for the 2 ranches she knew had gone to Drummond in the past 2 years. The Alderton Place, Northeast Quarter. The McCree Homestead, 300 acres along the creek. She set them side by side on the reading table and went through them the way Frank had taught her to read a contract, slowly, checking each detail against the others. The debt instruments for both properties looked identical in structure to the one Drummond had left on her kitchen table. Same form, same format. The signatures on both were the late owner's signatures. She'd known both men, not well, but enough. She looked at the pressure and the angle and the character of the letters. And then she looked at the date stamps and the witnesses listed. The same notary had witnessed both documents, a man whose name she didn't recognize, who wasn't listed anywhere in Sable Ridge's business registry. A ghost notary, on 2 separate instruments, 2 separate dead men's signatures. And now Frank Calloway's. This was not opportunistic theft. This was a plan, patient and deliberate, that had been running for at least 2 years. Drummond was acquiring land through systematic forgery, targeting ranches whose owners died or whose owners were isolated enough to be steamrolled before they could organize resistance. Nora stood in the land records room with the files spread before her and understood 3 things with complete clarity. First, she could not win through any official channel in Sable Ridge. Drummond owned them all. Second, she was not the first, which meant there might be witnesses, records, someone who knew the mechanism of the forgery from the inside. Third, she had 72 hours, and she had already used 6 of them. She rode home in the late afternoon, fed the horses, made supper for Pete and the 2 remaining hands, ate nothing herself, sat at the kitchen table after the others had gone to the bunkhouse and looked at the lamp flame for a long time. Frank's coffee cup was still on the shelf where he'd left it Monday morning. She didn't move it. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, and she lay in the dark listening to the Colorado wind work its way through the gap in the north window frame that Frank had been meaning to fix since September, and she made herself think through every option remaining. And when she had exhausted them all, she started again. She slept 2 hours before dawn. That next day, Her last full day before Drummond's deadline, Nora went back to Sable Ridge. Not because she had new options, because there was one more thing she hadn't tried, and leaving it untried was not something she was capable of. She went to the two families who'd known Frank the longest, the Garrity family and old Edmund Sears who'd ranched adjacent to the Calloways for 20 years. Both doors, both closed. Edmund Sears at least opened his far enough that she could see his face, and what she saw there was genuine misery. He owed Drummond on a promissory note of his own. His wife was watching from the hallway behind him. "I'm sorry, Nora," he said, and it was the most honest sorrow she'd heard all week, and it changed exactly nothing. She was riding back through town, her options reduced to zero, when she decided to stop at the saloon. Not for whiskey. She wasn't a whiskey woman. Hector Marsh ran a clean place and kept a pot of strong coffee on the stove year-round for the men who started early, and she needed to sit somewhere that wasn't her kitchen and think without the ghost of Frank's unwashed cough up watching her do it. She tied her horse at the rail, straightened her blouse and her skirt and walked in. There was a young woman sitting in the corner chair. Nora noticed her the way you notice something that doesn't fit the expected inventory of a room. Not dramatically, just as a fact requiring registration. Young, 20 or so, maybe a handful of years more. Brown duster over a dark flannel shirt, all buttons fastened. Worn, denim, trail boots. Hat on the table beside her coffee cup, after the manner of women who spent their days outdoors and needed their hair out of their eyes. She was sitting with her back to the wall and her eyes on the room, and those eyes were not the eyes of a woman who had just arrived. They were the eyes of a woman who had been watching this specific room for long enough to have catalogued it. Hector poured Nora's coffee without being asked. She took it to a table. She spent 10 minutes thinking through the same wall she'd been walking into for 2 days. Then she made a decision that surprised even her. She got up, picked up her coffee, walked to the corner table, and sat down across from the young woman without asking. Wren Daly looked at her without alarm. Nora opened her satchel and took out the papers she'd copied in the land records office, careful, page by page in her own handwriting. Because the originals weren't hers to take, she set them on the table between them and said nothing. Wren picked up the top sheet. "Read it. Turn to the next one. Read that. Read the third." Set them down. Looked up at Nora. "I've seen this signature style before." Her voice was even. Flat the way flat country is flat, not empty. Just honest about what it is. Nora looked at her across the table. "Where?" "Durango. 10 years ago." Wren's jaw worked for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes and was controlled. Different county, different name on the paperwork. Same method. Nora set her coffee cup down. "You know who runs the method." Not a question. Wren understood that. Man named Drummond. He had a partner in Durango, went by a different name there. Partner's dead now. But Drummond's been working this same scheme since at least 72. She turned one of the pages over, looked at the notary's stamp, looked up. "Your husband, Frank, died Wednesday." A breath. "Small. I'm sorry. His signature is on a debt instrument for $3,800 he never signed. Deadline's tomorrow noon." Wren looked at the papers again, then looked out the saloon window at the bright dust of Main Street. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was not uncertainty. It was the quiet of a person laying out a specific mental map. "There's a man named Jasper Oakes." She said it the way you say something you've been holding for a long time. Carefully. He was Drummond's clerk, kept records. He knows the full mechanism who does the actual forgery, how the notary stamps are made, how many properties. He's been keeping a ledger, call it insurance on his own life. She paused. "He's in Millhaven, day and a half's ride northwest." Nora looked at her steadily. "How long have you been in Sable Ridge?" 3 days. "And you know about Jasper Oakes?" "I know about Drummond." Wren met her eyes. "I've been knowing about Drummond for 10 years. There was a long moment in which 2 women in a Colorado saloon looked at each other and understood the parts of the conversation that didn't require words. Then Nora said, "We ride at first light. Your deadline's tomorrow noon." "I know when my deadline is." Nora finished her coffee, stood up. "I'll be at the south gate of the Calloway Ranch at 4 in the morning. You need a horse?" "I have a horse." "Then I'll see you at 4. She walked out of the Dusty Boots saloon into the afternoon heat, and she did not look behind her. And Wren Daly watched the door swing shut and sat for a moment in the corner of the room and breathed in a way she didn't normally let herself breathe. because she hadn't planned for this specific version of events. She had planned to watch, to assess, to determine whether Drummond's Sable Ridge operation was far enough along to move against. She had not planned on a 55-year-old widow with silver hair and a spine like a wagon axle, walking into the same room and laying the entire problem out on the table and saying, "We ride at first light," as though that was the obvious and only logical next step, which Wren had to admit, sitting in the corner of the saloon with her cooling coffee, it kind of was. She had been in Durango when she was 14, not because she had any choice about it. Her father, a rancher named Cole Daly, had built his spread outside Durango over 15 years of unrelenting work. Cole Daly wasn't a large man or a loud one. He was methodical and patient, and he kept immaculate records, and he loved the land with the specific devotion of someone who had come from nothing and built something real with his hands. He had about 900 acres, a good well, and a herd that had taken 12 years to develop into quality stock. Then a man arrived with a debt instrument bearing Cole Daly's signature. Cole Daly had not signed it. He told the sheriff this. He told the banker. He told the circuit judge who came through 3 weeks later. He could prove through his own ledger that he had never received the funds specified. None of it mattered. The machinery was already in motion, and the machinery was owned by the same people he was appealing to. 6 months later, Cole Daly's ranch was gone. A year after that, Wren's mother was dead of a fever that proper housing might have helped her survive. Another year, and Cole Daly had become the kind of man who sat in other people's saloons and stared at nothing. Wren had been 14 when this started, old enough to understand it, too young to stop it. She had spent 10 years deciding what to do with those two facts. She had learned to ride in a way that made distance manageable rather than prohibitive. She had learned, through 2 seasons working cattle in the Panhandle and 1 season on a horse ranch in New Mexico territory, to handle a firearm with the precision that comes from repetition rather than natural gift. She was not a gunfighter. She was a woman who practiced until she was accurate and kept that information to herself. She had followed the thread of Drummond's operation from county to county over 5 years, learning its patterns, identifying its mechanisms, waiting for the convergence of evidence and opportunity that would make action possible rather than merely satisfying. Sable Ridge was that convergence. Jasper Oak's ledger was the key, and now there was Nora Calloway. What Wren had not factored in, what she had no precedent for calculating, was the quality of the woman herself. Nora Calloway had ridden into town the day after her husband died, had spent 2 days methodically attempting every legitimate avenue available to her, had been turned away from every door, had spent her evenings in the Land Records office building, a structural understanding the scheme being used against her, and had then walked into a saloon and sat down across from a stranger and made an alliance in less than 10 minutes without a single word that was not precise and necessary. That was not grief. Or rather, grief was there, visible if you knew how to look in the set of her jaw. In the particular way she held very still when she wasn't moving, as though motion cost more than it had cost before. But the grief had not unmoored her. It had not loosened her grip on what needed to be done. She was carrying it and moving forward through it, the way people do when they've been on the frontier long enough to understand that the land doesn't pause for mourning, and therefore you carry it with you or you leave it behind, and Nora Calloway was not the kind of woman who left things behind. Wren sat in the saloon until sunset. Then she went to the room she'd rented at the back of the boarding house, packed what she'd unpacked, which was not much, and set her internal clock for 3 in the morning. She was at the south gate of the Calloway ranch before 4. Nora was already there, saddled and ready, her work skirt exchanged for a heavier divided riding skirt in dark wool, her blouse buttoned to the throat, her wide-brimmed hat tied down against wind. She had a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a canvas bag strapped behind the cantle. She glanced at Wren, noted the duster, the denim, the plain iron spurs, the holster, said nothing about any of it. She turned her horse northwest. Wren fell in alongside her. They rode through the dark in silence, which was the correct thing to do at 4 in the morning on an unfamiliar trail when you were in a hurry and had nothing to prove to each other yet. The Colorado night was cold and clear, stars improbably dense at altitude, the trail visible by starlight once their eyes adjusted. An hour out, they hit the first ridge and Nora's horse picked up the pace without being asked, knowing the trail. Wren kept up without comment. Around 5:30, with the sky beginning to go gray at the eastern edge, Nora said. Without looking over, what was his name? The man in Durango. Wren kept her eyes on the trail ahead. He went by Crane, first name Thomas. He was Drummond's partner then. A pause. He died in 78. Fell off a horse, said. Did he? Probably not. Another stretch of silence. The horses moved steadily, breath visible in the cold air, hooves on hard ground. Your father, Nora said, lost everything in 72. Wren's voice was level. Not flat in the way of someone suppressing feeling. Flat in the way of someone who has processed the same material so many times it no longer has sharp edges. He's still in Durango. He's not the same man. No. Nora said it without elaboration, but with the weight of someone who understood the specific category of loss being described. Not death, the other kind. The sky went from gray to rose. They stopped to water the horses at a creek crossing. Not because they needed to stop, but because the horses needed it, and the horses were what would get them to Millhaven. Nora stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the water while her horse drank. Frank would have liked you, she said. Not sentimentally, factually. He had no patience for people who couldn't think straight under pressure. Wren looked at her horse's ears, which were relaxed and forward. Your husband, the one who taught you the land records. Frank could read a contract like a map. Showed me how the first year we were married. A short pause. Said any land you hold is only as good as your understanding of how it's held. Smart man, yes. Clean and simple. He was. They mounted again as the sun crested the eastern ridge, and the light turned gold across the scrub and the red rock outcroppings. Wren had ridden through this kind of country enough times to register it without sentimentality. But it was objectively the kind of morning that reminded you the land had no interest in human problems, which she found clarifying rather than discouraging. They were 2 hours out of Millhaven when Wren spotted the tracks. She pulled her roan up without signaling Nora, simply stopping, and Nora stopped beside her on instinct. Wren was already off her horse, crouching at the trail's edge, looking at the ground. 2 sets of hoofprints. Recent. Same direction as theirs. Hard-ridden, the impressions deep and close together at the back. She looked up at the angle of the morning light, calculated time and distance. 4 hours ahead of us, she said. Nora's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes went very still. Drummond. He had ears in that saloon. Wren straightened. He knows about Jasper. They looked at each other across their horses in the morning light. The calculation was obvious, and required no extended discussion. 2 armed men. 4-hour lead, arriving at a frightened old man's house before they did. Wren turned to remount, and Nora was already moving, and they didn't speak again because there was nothing to say that wasn't already being said by the speed at which they both kicked their horses into a canter on a trail that was about to become significantly more dangerous. And in Sable Ridge, 40 miles southeast, the morning was going forward without them. Silas Drummond had risen at his usual hour, breakfasted, and walked to his land office. He sat behind his desk and read a letter from a cattle operation in Kansas and drank his coffee. At 10 o'clock, he called Deputy Vane into the office and gave him specific instructions. At 11, he put on his hat and his vest and his watch chain and walked to the front of his office and stood in the doorway, watching the street. At 11:30, Vane and 3 hired men rode out to the Calloway ranch. Pete Garner, Nora's foreman of 11 years, heard them coming up the drive and came out of the barn. He was a man of 60 with bad knees, and the sort of patience that comes from having worked hard ground all his life. He watched the 4 riders come in and knew immediately what they were there for, and also knew that there was nothing he could do about it. He was one man. He positioned himself between the riders and the front porch of the ranch house anyway, because that was the kind of man he was. Vane told him to stand aside. He didn't. 2 of the hired men dismounted and moved him. They were not gentle about it. Pete hit the ground beside the water trough and stayed there because trying to get up again wasn't going to accomplish anything except getting him hit again. They went inside, came out with Nora's papers, her lockbox, her ledger. They found her rifle by the door and took that too. Then Vane told the other man to find something to tie to the saddle, and they found the ranch's spare rope in the barn, and they rode back to Sable Ridge. Nora wasn't there to be collected. But Drummond had anticipated that probability. He had another option. At noon, a rider Drummond had posted on the road northwest returned. Nora Calloway had not come back, which meant the plan with Wren Daly was further along than Drummond had preferred to allow. He adjusted. He called 2 more men off the afternoon shift and told them to ride to Millhaven faster than they'd ridden anywhere recently. Then he sent Vane's crew back out to the Calloway ranch, this time with different instructions. Pete Garner, still sitting beside the water trough with a split lip and a bruised shoulder, watched them come back up the drive in the early afternoon. He stood up. His knees were bad and his shoulder hurt, and he stood up anyway. When the barn ignited at 2 in the afternoon, Pete ran for the water barrel and the bucket brigade of exactly 1 man. He was still working when the smoke had gone from black to gray, and the structure was beyond saving, and there was nothing left to do but soak the embers and make sure the house didn't go. In Sable Ridge, Drummond had been busy in a different way. He had word sent to his remaining men. He had sent a letter to the circuit court in Denver, preemptive, establishing his legal position on the Calloway property. He had spoken with Hale and made certain the sheriff understood the afternoon's program, and he had walked the length of Main Street at 3 o'clock, making himself visible, letting the town know that whatever was going to happen next had his sanction. At 4 in the afternoon, with the sun still high and hot, Vane and 4 men rode back into town with Nora Calloway's horse on a lead rope. The story they told was that they'd found her on the northwest road, returning from wherever she'd gone, and had brought her back in. This was not the truth. The full truth was that they had waited at the Millhaven Road junction for 2 hours after receiving Drummond's message, and when Nora came back alone, Wren was 100 yards back, watching from the tree line, having identified the waiting men. Before Nora cleared the junction, Nora had ridden straight into them without flinching. She had not tried to run. She had looked at the 4 armed men across her horse's neck and said, quietly, "Where's your employer?" They brought her back to Sable Ridge with her hands bound and the town watching from the boardwalks as they came down Main Street. Drummond was waiting in front of the land office. He had Deputy Vane with him. He had the full street for an audience. "I gave you fair notice, Mrs. Calloway," he said. Nora said nothing. Drummond nodded to Vane. The whip came down before the town remembered how to breathe. It was the second time in 24 hours that Nora Calloway had knelt in the dust of Sable Ridge. But this time was different from the theoretical one she'd been preparing for in the privacy of her own mind. This time the dust was real, and the pain across her back was real, and the silence of the crowd on both boardwalks was real, an active and living thing. The silence of people who were watching themselves fail to do the right thing, and knowing it and doing nothing anyway. She looked at the fixed point past the hitching post, past the street, past all of it. Drummond's voice again, and then 2 words from the south end of the street, landing in that silence like a stone into still water. "Drop it." Wren Daly had ridden hard back from the Millhaven junction. She had watched them take Nora from a position where she couldn't intervene without being taken herself, and she had made the call that being taken served no one. So she had ridden south and come in around the back of town, while Vane's crew was coming in from the north, and she had positioned herself at the south end of Main Street, with her roan standing quiet and her right hand resting near the holster and the clearest possible view of the entire street. She had been waiting for the moment. This was the moment. Vane turned toward her. Drummond turned toward her. 47 people on 2 boardwalks turned toward her. She walked the roan forward, slow, no hurry in it. The dust came up around the horse's feet in small quiet clouds. She walked into the middle of Main Street and stopped, and she looked down at Nora Calloway in the red dust with her hands bound and her back hurt and her chin up, and she looked at Rex Vane with his whip, and she looked at Silas Drummond in his black wool suit on the boardwalk. "Cut her loose," Wren said. Drummond stepped off the boardwalk. He was smiling. He looked at the young woman on the road horse, and he did the calculation of a man who had owned this street for years and found the numbers added up the same as always. Wren's hand moved. The whip came down before the town remembered how to breathe. That was the thing about Sable Ridge in the autumn of 1882. It had forgotten how to breathe, how to speak, how to do anything except watch from behind shuttered windows and half-latched doors while the worst thing imaginable happened in plain daylight on Main Street, and nobody, not one single soul, stepped off the boardwalk to stop it. The sound of leather cracking against a woman's back traveled the full length of the street, past the general store, past the barber shop with its red and white pole, past the assay office with fade-fitted painted letters, going to pieces in the Colorado heat. It traveled into every doorway and settled there like smoke, like something that would need years to clear. Nora Calloway was on her knees in the red dust, 55 years old, and on her knees in front of the whole town she had helped build with 30 years of honest work, and not one person on those boardwalks could meet her eyes. Her dark wool divided riding skirt had gone the color of the earth beneath her. Her white linen blouse, buttoned to the collarbone the way she wore it every morning without exception, had been pulled loose from one shoulder when Rex Vane's men dragged her off her horse an hour earlier. Her silver hair, always knotted tight at the base of her neck before she left the house, hung in pieces across her jaw. Her wrists were bound behind her with rough hemp rope, the same kind ranchers used to hobble livestock, pulled tight enough to leave marks that would still be visible a week later. Her worn leather boots were planted in the dust, heels dug in, as though even on her knees she was refusing to slide forward another inch. She was not crying. Her jaw was set so hard the tendons in her neck stood out like fence wire under tension. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere past the hitching post, past the street, past the roof lines of Sable Ridge and the red rock ridgeline beyond, past all of it. Whatever she was looking at, it was not here. Deputy Rex Vane rolled the long leather whip back over his shoulder a second time. He was a broad man in his mid-30s with a flat face and a fondness for his own authority. He wore a leather vest over a heavy flannel shirt, a canvas-brimmed hat pulled low, denim trousers tucked into tall leather boots with plain iron spurs. He held the whip the way a man holds something he has practiced holding. Not tense about it. Familiar. Again, said Silas Drummond. He said it the way a man orders coffee. Flat, unremarkable, not angry, not excited. Just a man naming what comes next as though it were already determined, which in his mind it was. Drummond was standing on the boardwalk in front of his land offices in his black three-piece wool suit, the gold watch chain catching the noon light across his vest, one thumb hooked in the pocket of that vest. He hadn't broken a sweat. He was watching Nora Calloway kneel in the red dirt, with the mild interest of a man observing whether he'd predicted correctly, and found no particular pleasure in being right about, because being right was simply the baseline of his existence. Vane drew his arm back. The crowd on both boardwalks did not move. 40, maybe 50 people, ranchers in their work coats and canvas trousers, shopkeepers in their aprons, the blacksmith still in his leather work apron with the burns across the bib, women in their calico dresses and bonnets, a man from the stamp mill in his dusty work clothes, standing with his hands loose at his sides, us. Every single one of them watching. Every single one of them measuring the distance between themselves and the hitching post and deciding, one by one, and collectively and instantly, that the distance was insurmountable. The silence on that street was not the absence of sound. The wind moved. A horse shifted its weight at the rail. Somewhere a door hinge complained. The silence was the absence of human will. The specific, thunderous silence of a group of people who have individually decided that the risk of speaking out weighs the cost of watching, and who will spend the rest of their lives rearranging the logic of that decision so it looks like something other than what it was. Vane's arm was at the top of its arc. Then a voice came from the south end of Main Street. 2 words, female, young, level as a carpenter's line. Drop it. Vane's arm stopped, not because he'd been ordered to stop by anyone whose orders he was obligated to follow, because the voice had a quality that short-circuited the ordinary progression of action before the brain could explain why. It was the kind of voice that had already finished the conversation before it started it. Every head on that street turned south. At the far edge of town, sitting completely still on the back of a blue roan mare, was a young woman. She hadn't ridden in dramatically. She hadn't announced herself. She was simply there, the way something becomes visible when the light shifts present suddenly where it had not seemed to be a moment before. Brown duster coat, long past the knee, pale with trail dust from collar to hem. A dark flannel shirt buttoned to the throat, heavy denim. Tall leather boots worn to the shape of her feet, plain iron spurs. Her hat brim threw a straight line of shadow across the upper half of her face. Her right hand rested at her side, near the holster at her hip, resting, not reaching, just resting there with a kind of patience that was its own form of statement. The blue roan stood without fidgeting. The rider sat without fidgeting. In the middle of a street where every other living creature was in some state of internal agitation, The stillness of those two was remarkable. Wren Daly was 24 years old. She had been in Sable Ridge for 3 days. Not one person on that street knew her name yet. Vane turned his head toward the south end of the street. His face did the thing faces do when they're deciding whether to be contemptuous or cautious and go with contemptuous, because the other option is an admission. Mind your business, girl. This is county business. Wren's hand didn't move from where it rested. The roan shifted its weight 1 inch and went still again. The rope on her wrists. Her voice carried clean down the street without effort, the way sound carries when the surrounding silence is complete. Cut it now. Drummond stepped to the edge of the boardwalk. He looked at the young woman with the mild curiosity of a man examining a fence post that has appeared where no fence post was surveyed to be. Then the corner of his mouth moved in a way that substituted for a smile without being one. He spoke to no one in particular, the way a man speaks when he's certain the room is his. Someone remove her from my street. 2 of his hired men pushed off the wall of the land office. Heavy coats, holstered revolvers, the unhurried walk of men who did this for wages and had no personal investment in any particular outcome. Wren clicked her tongue once. The roan walked forward, not fast, not aggressive. The slow, deliberate walk of a horse and rider who have both decided where they are going and see no reason to hurry about getting there. Dust lifted in small, quiet clouds under the roan's hooves. The hired men adjusted their course to intercept her. Wren didn't adjust anything. She rode straight down the center of Main Street, as though the hired men were fence posts she intended to ride around at the last possible moment, which is exactly what she did, cutting the roan left at the final stride, with the ease of someone who has spent more hours in the saddle than out of it. And by the time the 2 men had turned to follow her angle, she was already past them and still moving forward. She stopped in the middle of the street, 20 feet from Nora Calloway, 25 feet from Silas Drummond on his boardwalk, 8 feet from Deputy Rex Vane and his whip. She looked down at Nora Calloway in the red dust. Whatever she had been preparing herself to feel in this moment had been filed under a different category than what was actually happening, because the woman kneeling in the dust was not a stranger. Not exactly. Wren had never met Nora Calloway before she walked into the Dusty Boot Saloon, but she recognized the specific arrangement of that face, the jaw set against pain, the eyes fixed on a point that was not here. The refusal to collapse that was not stubbornness but something harder and more considered than stubbornness. She had seen that arrangement before, in a kitchen in Durango 10 years earlier, on a woman who was running out of ways to fight and knew it and kept fighting anyway. She had not saved that woman. She was here now. Wren swung down from the saddle, both feet on the ground. She reached into her coat and pulled out a short folding knife, and she walked to Nora Calloway, and she crouched behind her, and she cut the rope in one clean stroke. Nora's hands came free. She caught herself on the hitching post with both palms. She stayed on her knees for one breath too while the feeling came back into her wrists. Then she stood up. She did not do it dramatically. She did it the way she did everything, one movement at a time, each one deliberate, as though the universe would be required to wait while she completed it. She turned and looked at Wren. The look lasted a second and said a great deal more than that. Wren was already looking at Drummond. She'd pulled her revolver during the 2 seconds it took Nora to stand. It was in her right hand, level, pointed at the center of Drummond's chest, at a range where missing was not a concept that applied. Tell your men to put their guns on the ground. The hired men at Drummond's back had their hands on their revolvers, had not drawn them, because Wren's gun had come out in the interval between one blink and the next, and the math on the situation was not complicated. Drummond's face did something she had not seen it do before, not in 3 days of watching him from the corner of the saloon. It recalculated. You're making, he said carefully, a significant error. Your men. Guns on the ground. Last time I say it. A long second. Drummond's eyes moved across the street the way a man's eyes move when he's checking the location of his assets. He found them, and found the situation, and found that the arithmetic was not currently favorable. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. 4 revolvers hit the dirt. Vane's came last. He dropped it the way a man drops something he intends to pick back up shortly. Drummond looked at Wren with the particular patience of a man who is accustomed to the long game. This changes nothing. The note is legal. The property transfer will stand. And you, he let his eyes travel over her face the way a man takes inventory, will be in my jail by morning, if you're lucky enough to still be in this county. Wren reached into the inside pocket of her duster with her left hand. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, the copied pages from Nora's satchel, the ones from the Land Records office. She held them up, not performing, just visible. 2 years ago, the Alderton place went to you on a debt instrument. Year before that, the McCree homestead. Same notary on both documents. Man who doesn't appear in any business registry in this county. Her voice carried down the street the way it had carried the first time, not loud, just clean. Every person on those boardwalks could hear it. The same notary, just appeared on a debt instrument for the Calloway ranch. Frank Calloway died 4 days ago. His widow had 72 hours to produce $3,800 or lose her land. The whispers started on the boardwalks. Not loud, not unified. The specific sound of individual people beginning to revise their understanding of events they had watched unfold over 2 years without connecting them. Drummond's face settled into something careful. That document is a copy. It has no legal standing, no. Wren folded it back up and put it away. But the original records in the county land office do, and the man who knows how every one of those notary stamps was made is prepared to say so. She looked at Drummond directly. His name is Jasper Oakes. I imagine you know where he is. Something moved behind Drummond's eyes. Fast, gone. The whispers on the boardwalks were louder now. A woman in a calico dress had stepped forward from the wall of the dry goods store and was standing at the boardwalk's edge. The blacksmith had his arms crossed and was looking at Drummond with an expression that had left neutral some time ago. Drummond looked at the street, at the crowd, at Wren. He was doing the math again, and the math was changing, but it had not yet changed enough. Not with 4 revolvers on the ground and one in her hand and an old man's ledger book a day and a half's ride away. He put his hat back on his head and straightened his vest. 2 days, he said, to the street, to all of them, to no one. In 2 days, the Calloway property transfers legally, and this young woman will learn the cost of interfering in county business. He stepped back onto the boardwalk. Pick up your weapons, he said to his men. He walked into the land office and closed the door behind him. The crowd on the boardwalk stood for a moment in the particular suspended state of people who have watched a confrontation end without a clear winner and are unsettled by the ambiguity. Then, one by one, they began to drift back to their own business. The woman in the calico dress was the last to move. She looked at Nora Calloway for a long moment at the torn blouse shoulder, the red dust still on her skirt, the marks on her wrists, and then she looked at Wren, and she went back inside. Nora looked at the door of the land office where Drummond had gone. Then she looked at Wren. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only Wren could hear it. You said Jasper Oakes is in Millhaven, day and a half northwest. Drummond just heard his name. Yes. He'll send men tonight. Yes. Nora looked at the marks on her wrists, pulled her blouse back up onto her shoulder, looked at the angle of the sun. We have 4 hours of light. Wren caught the roan's reins. Your horse is at the rail in front of the saloon. I checked her before I came down the street. She's rested. Nora walked toward the saloon without another word. Wren walked beside her. On the boardwalks, a few remaining onlookers watched them go. Nobody said anything. They stopped at the saloon long enough for Nora to retrieve her saddlebag from Hector behind the bar. She'd left it with him that morning, containing her copied land records documents, and a change of clothes, and for Wren to fill her canteen at the pump in the back alley. Hector looked at Nora's torn shoulder and the marks on her wrists and set a glass of water on the bar without being asked, and then removed himself to the far end of the counter. Nora drank the water, set the glass down. He'll have someone watching the road northwest. He'll have someone watching every road out of town. Wren shouldered her canteen strap. We go southeast first, 2 miles, then cut west through the canyon system. Adds 3 hours but avoids the main trail until we're past his watch posts. Nora looked at her. You've ridden that canyon route. Yesterday morning, before you came into the saloon, Wren held the saloon door for her. I wanted to know it was there. They rode southeast out of Sable Ridge as the afternoon light went golden and long across the scrubland. 2 women on horseback moving at a pace that would have looked, to anyone observing from a distance, like the unhurried travel of people with nothing particular pressing them. Which was the point. Past the edge of town, past the last of the survey stakes, marking the town's legal boundary, they picked up speed. The trail dropped into the first of the canyon cuts half a mile out, red rock walls rising on both sides, and they moved through the shadows quickly and without talking. because the canyon acoustics made conversation carry in unpredictable directions. They made us onto the high plateau on the western side. As the sun touched the top of the western ridgeline, the light was going orange, then red, the Colorado sky staging one of its excessive and indifferent spectacles overhead. They pushed the horses for another 2 hours in the remaining light, and then made camp in a hollow behind a sandstone outcropping, where a fire wouldn't be visible from the trail. Nora unsaddled her horse with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 30 years, and then sat on her bedroll and began working at the dried blood on her wrists, with water from her canteen and a square of cloth she'd brought for exactly this kind of eventuality. She did not make any sound while she did it. Wren unsaddled the roan, hobbled both horses with a long lead so they could graze the sparse grass, and built a fire small enough to boil water and no bigger. The coffee Wren carried was trail ground and adequate. She handed Nora a tin cup and settled back against the rock face with her own. The silence between them was different from the silence of the morning. Morning's silence had been the silence of two strangers who didn't yet know whether they were allies or just people temporarily occupying the same piece of geography. This silence had a different texture. Something had been established between the hitching post and the canyon and the fire, though neither of them would have used the word established. It was more that certain questions had been answered by observable behavior and didn't need to be raised again. Nora said, into the fire, "Tell me about Jasper Oaks." Wren turned her tin cup in her hands. He was Drummond's land clerk for 4 years, kept records of every transaction, legitimate and otherwise. He saw the forgery operation from the inside. Not just here either. He was with Drummond in New Mexico territory before this. Saw the same scheme run twice before Sable Ridge. She paused. He kept a ledger. Names, dates, properties, the man who actually made the forged signatures. Every transaction for 6 years. Why didn't he go to the law? Because every law office he could have gone to was in a county where Drummond had already established his position. Wren looked at the fire, and because he was afraid. He's an old man, and he was afraid, and he kept the ledger because having it meant Drummond couldn't have him killed without risking the ledger surfacing. And that was enough to keep him alive, but not enough to make him brave. A pause. Until now, maybe. Nora looked at her over the rim of the tin cup. You've spoken to him once? 6 months ago, in Millhaven, before I knew this was where Drummond was going to move next. He told me about the ledger. He said he'd kept it safe for 10 years. He said he'd thought about coming forward 100 times. She looked at the fire. He said he'd been waiting for someone to come who was worth the risk. Nora was quiet for a moment. You think he'll come to Sable Ridge, make his testimony public? I think he's been sitting in that house in Millhaven for 10 years knowing what he knows, and watching it keep him safe and knowing that safe and right are not the same thing. Wren looked up. He's ready. He just needs someone to come for him. The fire worked at its business. The horses moved quietly in the dark beyond the firelight. Somewhere on the plateau, a coyote made its inquiry of the night sky and received no answer. Nora said, Frank would have handled this differently. Wren waited. He'd have wanted to believe the system would work. He had that faith in institutions. 30 years on the frontier, and he still believed that if you could demonstrate wrongdoing clearly enough, the mechanisms of justice would engage. She looked at the fire. He wasn't naive. He just chose to believe in the better possibility until the evidence made it impossible. And I believed in him. Simple and flat and carrying the weight of 30 years in 4 words. Which meant when he was wrong about something, I was there to know it before it cost us everything. A pause. He would have gone to the sheriff. I went to the land records first. Wren thought about her father, who had believed in the system with his whole chest and paid for that belief with everything he had built, and then with everything he was. She thought about what it would mean to have someone beside you who loved you and still knew when you were wrong. She thought about the specific loneliness of not having that. She didn't say any of that. She said, we need to be in Millhaven before Drummond's men get to Jasper. What's our time? They left tonight. They're riding fast. They could be there by mid-morning. Wren poured the remaining coffee into the dirt and set the tin cup upside down on her knee. We leave 2 hours before dawn. Push hard. We arrive around the same time. Maybe before? Maybe not. Nora nodded once. She finished her coffee. She lay down on her bedroll with her hat over her face, which was her method of telling the world she was done with it. Until further notice, and within 10 minutes her breathing had gone to the steady rhythm of actual sleep, which Wren recognized as the sleep of someone who had trained themselves to take rest when it was available, regardless of circumstances, because the frontier didn't schedule its crises around your convenience, and you learned to work within its calendar, or you didn't last. Wren sat with her back against the sandstone, and watched the fire die down to coals, and watched the stars wheel overhead the way they did out here, where there was no competing light, and she let herself think about tomorrow, not anxiously, practically. She laid out the variables the way you laid out a trail before you rode it distances, conditions, contingencies, which she had some control over and which she didn't. Jasper Oaks, the ledger, 2 armed men with a 4-hour head start, a town 50 miles back that had watched a widow get whipped in the street and done nothing, a sheriff who was in Drummond's pocket, a land office full of documents that proved a pattern but couldn't prove intent without someone who had been inside the room, and Nora Calloway, asleep 3 feet away with her hat over her face and her wrists wrapped in cloth and her spine as straight on a bedroll on a Colorado plateau as it was behind the kitchen table of a ranch house she'd spent 30 years building. Wren thought about what it would cost Jasper Oaks to walk into Main Street in Sable Ridge and say what he knew in front of everyone who needed to hear it. She thought about the 10 years he'd spent in Millhaven waiting for the calculation to change. She thought about whether it had changed enough. She thought it had. She thought that Drummond sending armed men to a frightened old man's house in the middle of the night was to change the calculation the rest of the way. Because there is a point at which the thing protecting you and the thing you are hiding from become indistinguishable, and when that happens, the only option left is to step out into the open. She pulled her hat down over her eyes. 2 hours before dawn she was already awake, moving quietly in the dark, saddling the horses before the horizon had shown the first gray. Nora was awake before Wren touched her shoulder, which confirmed what Wren had already suspected, that the sleep had been real, but the awareness underneath it had been running the whole time, the way a good cattle dog sleeps near the herd, with one ear always pointing toward the dark. They rode northwest in the dark fast, and the stars went out one by one as the sky ahead of them began its slow, reluctant transaction with morning. And behind them, Sable Ridge was waking up to a day it didn't yet know would be the last day Silas Drummond's name meant what it had always meant in that town. 40 miles east, in his office above the land records, Drummond was reading the overnight reports from his men. 2 on the road northwest, 2 watching the canyon approaches, 1 at the telegraph office monitoring outgoing messages. The operation was moving as operations did when they were well designed and well funded and run by someone who had been doing this for long enough to have removed most of the variables. He was not worried about the young woman with the road horse and the flat voice. He was not worried about Nora Calloway with her silver hair and her marked wrists and her dead husband's ranch that would be legally transferred by end of week. He was not worried about Jasper Oaks in Millhaven, who had been sitting on his ledger for 10 years, and who Drummond had always known about and always factored into his planning, because a frightened man with insurance is a predictable man, and predictable men could be managed. What Drummond was, in the quiet of his well-appointed office, with the morning light coming through the glass window he'd had shipped in from Denver at significant expense, was certain. He had been certain before. He had been certain in New Mexico territory, and before that in Kansas, and before that in 3 other counties across the West. And certainty had served him well every single time. He picked up his coffee cup and looked out the window at Main Street, coming to life below him, the blacksmith opening his doors, the general store sweeping its porch, a wagon pulling up to the feed depot. His street, his town, his county. He drank his coffee. He was not worried. He should have been, because 2 women were riding hard through the canyon country, northwest of Sable Ridge in the gray hour before dawn. And one of them had been working toward this specific moment for 10 years and knew every variable Drummond thought he had accounted for, and the other one had been fighting for her land and her name, and the life she and Frank Calloway had built, since before she had enough information to fight effectively, and now she had the information, and she had the direction, and she had nothing left to lose in the way that makes people genuinely dangerous, not the way of recklessness, but the way of someone who has identified what matters and removed everything else from the equation. The sun came up over the eastern ridgeline and turned the Red Canyon country gold. The two horses ran. Sable Ridge held its breath and waited for something it didn't have a name for yet. It would have one by nightfall. The tracks were 2 hours fresher than Wren had hoped. She knew it before she finished reading them. The depth of the rear impressions, the way the dirt at the edge of each print still held its shape without crumbling, the absence of the fine wind drift that accumulated over time in this kind of open country. She crouched at the edge of the trail and looked at the ground the way her father had taught her to look at it, before everything else her father had taught her became irrelevant, and what the ground was telling her was not good. Nora had pulled her horse up 3 feet back and was watching Wren's face rather than the tracks, because Wren's face would tell her what she needed to know faster than the tracks would. 2 hours. Wren stood, dusted her hands on her denim. Maybe less. Nora's jaw moved once. How far to Millhaven? Hour and a half if we push. They looked at each other across the distance between their horses, and the math was obvious, and neither of them set, because saying it would have taken time they didn't have. Nora turned her horse and kicked it into a lope before Wren was fully back in the saddle, which told Wren everything she needed to know about how Nora Calloway processed information she didn't like. They rode hard. The country northwest of Sable Ridge was high mesa broken by arroyos and rimrock formations, red and tan and washed pale in the October light, the kind of landscape that was indifferent to human urgency in the most complete possible way. The trail dropped twice into creek cuts and climbed out the other side, and the horses worked through it without complaint because Nora's mare was a ranch horse that knew this kind of ground, and Wren's roan had been ridden over worse on shorter notice. Wren rode with her eyes moving between the trail ahead and the tracks alongside it and the ridgelines on both sides. Not anxious, calibrated. The difference between the two states was the difference between a loose wire and a taut, one same material. Different tension, completely different utility. Nora rode with her eyes forward and her spine straight and her hands quiet on the reins. And if her back still hurt from yesterday's whip, which it did, Wren had seen her move this morning. With the careful deliberateness of someone managing real pain, she had filed that information somewhere inaccessible and moved on. The first buildings of Millhaven appeared on the flat ground below the last ridge at just past 9 in the morning. Not much of a town. A main street of 4 blocks, a mill, a church, 2 saloons, a handful of houses spread out along the creek. The kind of place people came to when they wanted to be somewhere that wasn't quite nowhere without being somewhere anyone would think to look for them. Jasper Oaks had made a reasonable choice. Wren pulled the roan up at the top of the ridge and looked down at the town without going down into it yet. Nora came up beside her. 2 horses at the rail outside one of the saloons. 3 horses at the livery. A wagon in front of the dry goods. Ordinary morning in a small town. Nothing obviously wrong with the picture, which meant nothing. Because the thing about men who did this kind of work for Drummond was that they were competent at the basic mechanics of not being obvious. They wouldn't tie their horses in front of Jasper's house. They'd be inside already, or coming out, or waiting around the side. Yellow house at the end of the cross street. Wren kept her voice low from habit. Not necessity, they were too far up for anyone in town to hear them. Second from the creek. Nora looked, found it, looked back at Wren. You've been here before. Once, 6 months ago. He was using the name Elias Marsh then. May have changed it since. She scanned the cross street, a woman hanging washing, a dog, no horses visible. I go in through the back, you come in through the front, if his door is open. I've done this before. Nora's voice was dry as the mesa they were standing on. Wren looked at her, decided she believed it. Then you know that if his door is open, we don't announce ourselves before we understand what's on the other side of it. They came down off the ridge on opposite angles and entered Millhaven from different ends of the main street, 4 minutes apart, at the walking pace of people who had ordinary business in the town. Wren went to the livery first and gave the roan a bucket of water and paid for an hour's use of a stall, which gave her a reason to be there and a reason to have come in from the north. She noted the 2 horses she'd seen from the ridge. Trail horses, hard-ridden, still breathing a little quick. Recent arrivals. She walked from the livery to the cross street at the back way, staying on the far side, using the wall of the mill as cover for the last stretch before she turned toward the creek end of the street. The yellow house had a fence, a small yard. A back door with a step she remembered was loose on the left side. She moved through the yard without touching the step, tested the back door unlocked, which was either carelessness or someone had already been through it, and pushed it open an inch at a time. The kitchen, empty. Breakfast dishes on the table, 1 cup, 1 plate, coffee still in the pot on the stove, warm when she held her hand near it, recent. A sound from the front room, not violent, controlled. The sound of a conversation being conducted at a volume calibrated to stay inside the house, which meant there were at least 2 voices, and at least one of them didn't want to be heard outside. Wren moved through the kitchen to the doorway. Jasper Oakes was in the corner between the window and the wall, and the corner wasn't large enough for him and the fear that was also in it. He was older than Wren remembered from 6 months ago, or fear was aging him in real time. White hair gone to wisps, hands visible where they were pressed flat against the wall behind him, his work shirt and loose trousers, the clothes of a man who had been gotten out of bed by something that hadn't given him time to dress properly. He was 70 years old and he looked every one of them and then some. The man standing in front of him was not someone Wren recognized, which meant he was one of Drummond's newer hires, broad through the shoulder, trail coat, hat still on. A second man was at the front window watching the street, both of them between Jasper and the door. The man in front of Jasper was speaking in the low, patient voice of someone who had learned that patience was more frightening than volume in most situations. "The book, Mr. Oakes. That's all we're here for. Give us the book and we'll be on our way, and nobody needs to know we were ever in this town." Jasper's hands pressed harder against the wall. "There is no book. Mr. Drummond knows there is, still patient, still low. He's known for years. He just never needed it before. He needs it now." Wren registered the geometry of the room in the 2 seconds she had to do it, before the man at the window turned his head in her direction. Wide front room. Jasper in the far corner. First man 6 feet from Wren's doorway with his back mostly to her. Second man at the window, starting to turn. 2 revolvers visible in holsters, neither drawn. She stepped into the room. "Hands where I can see them." Her voice hit the room at the same volume as the first man had been using, which meant it hit him in the back of the neck, at a range where the sound and the revolver she was now holding arrived together in his awareness simultaneously. He went very still. The man at the window completed his turn, and found himself looking at a situation that had changed while he was looking the other way. His right hand moved toward his holster, and stopped because the arithmetic of moving toward it was not arithmetic that ended well for him. Jasper's face when he saw Wren was the face of a man who has bargained with God on the specifics, and had the terms honored in a form he didn't expect. The front door opened. Nora Calloway came through it with her revolver already in hand, the short-barreled one from her saddle bag, and she positioned herself to Wren's left without needing to be told where to stand. And the 2 men in the room found themselves at the center of a geometry that had no favorable interpretation available to them. Guns on the floor. Wren's voice had not changed tempo or pitch. "Both of you. Left hand, 2 fingers, pull them out and set them down." The man in front of Jasper looked at the man at the window. The man at the window looked at Nora. Nora's expression communicated nothing, except that she had made her decision before she opened the door, and nothing that happened inside this room was going to revise it. Both revolvers went to the floor. Wren crossed the room, picked them up, set them on the kitchen table behind her. Nora stayed where she was. The man who had been talking to Jasper turned around slowly, as men do when they want to make clear they are not making any sudden decisions, and looked at Wren with the face of someone recalculating his employment options. "Tell Drummond," Wren said, "that Jasper Oakes is coming to Sable Ridge." She let that land. "Tell him we'll be there tomorrow. And tell him that whatever he's planning to do before we arrive, he should think hard about whether it makes things better or worse for him. Because the book exists, and he knows it, and a dead witness and a missing book doesn't close the story, it just changes the shape of it." The man at the former window position said, "For the first time, you're making a real bad mistake, miss." Nora didn't look at him. She was looking at Jasper Oakes in his corner. He's going to try that on her 3 more times before he believes it won't work. Flat, almost conversational, tie them to the chairs in the kitchen. We need 4 hours. Wren used the rope from her saddlebag. Both men in kitchen chairs, wrists to the chair arms, ankles to the legs. Tight enough to hold without cutting circulation, because cutting circulation was cruelty for no strategic gain, and Wren operated without decorative cruelty. She checked each knot twice, left the water pitcher within reach, closed the kitchen door. Jasper Oakes was still in his corner when she came back to the front room. He hadn't moved, as though the geometry that had put him there still applied, even though the men enforcing it were in another room. He was looking at Wren with an expression compounded of relief, and something older and heavier that relief hadn't cleared away. Nora was standing in the center of the room, revolver back in its place, looking at him with the direct patience of a woman who had been watching doors close in her face for 3 days, and was done with the preliminary courtesies. Jasper's voice, when it finally came, was rough with disuse, or with something else. I knew someone would come eventually. He looked at Wren. I thought it might be you, or someone like you. He looked at Nora. I didn't know about your husband. I'm sorry. Nora received the condolence without deflecting it. The ledger. Jasper moved for the first time. He crossed to the writing desk in the corner, opposite where he'd been standing, opened the bottom drawer, pressed the interior back panel with his thumb in a specific place, and lifted out a false bottom. Under it was a cloth-wrapped package the size of a prayer book. He set it on the desk without unwrapping it, and looked at it the way men look at things they have been holding for so long that the object and the weight of it have become inseparable in their minds. 10 years, he said. I've moved it 4 times. Changed the hiding place each time Drummond moved a new crew through the region. He looked up. I wrote everything down. Every property. Every name of the man who made the signatures. Drummond uses the same man, always has. A forger named Cull who works out of Santa Fe. The name of the traveling notary, the amounts, the dates. He looked at Nora. Your husband's note is in there, along with 11 others before it. 12 properties, 12 families. Some of them gone, some of them still in the county, some of them still inside the outcome of what this ledger described without knowing the mechanism that had produced that outcome. Nora picked up the cloth-wrapped package, did not open it, looked at Jasper directly. Will you come to Sable Ridge and say this publicly? The question sat in the room. Jasper looked at the package in her hands. He looked at the closed kitchen door, behind which Drummond's men were tied to chairs. He looked at Wren, who was watching him without expression, because she had learned that the expression on your face, iskis, when someone is deciding something important, can inadvertently push them toward the decision that's easiest to make, rather than the one that's hardest and most necessary. I've thought about coming forward, he said slowly. More times than I can count. Every time I heard about another property transfer. Every time I saw the pattern moving into a new county. He stopped. I told myself the ledger was enough. That having it meant something, that as long as I had it, I wasn't entirely. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The word at the end of it was visible anyway. Wren said quietly, not unkindly, you've been safe for 10 years, and you've been alone with what you know for 10 years. Those two things are the same thing. Jasper looked at her. The ledger protects you while it's a secret, Wren continued. The moment it's public, the protection is gone, but the silence is gone too. A long moment. The house was quiet around them. The small sounds of Millhaven going about its morning outside the windows, the creak audible faintly from the back of the house. Jasper picked up his hat from the hook beside the door, put it on, looked at Nora. Is there a livery in town? Nora's expression shifted by an amount that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. There is, then give me 10 minutes to pack what I need. He moved toward the back of the house, paused in the kitchen doorway. Looked at the 2 men tied to the chairs, looked back at Wren. How long will those hold? 4 hours if they don't dislocate anything. Jasper nodded once. I'll be fast, he was. He came back in 8 minutes with a saddlebag and a coat, and the look of a man who has been deciding something for 10 years and has finally decided it so completely that everything preceding the decision has become a different country he is already too far from to see clearly. They rode south out of Millhaven. 3 horses. The cloth-wrapped ledger in Nora's saddlebag, the October sun tracking west above the mesa. For the first hour no one talked. That was appropriate. Jasper needed the silence to adjust to what he'd done, and Nora needed it to think, and Wren needed it to watch the trail behind them, and the ridgelines on both sides, because Drummond's men would work free in 4 hours and ride fast, and she did not intend to be caught from behind on an open trail. They weren't. The afternoon moved forward without incident, which Wren noted without trusting. Then, an hour and a half out of Millhaven, with the sun going lower, and the shadows long across the trail, Jasper began to talk. Not because anyone asked him to, because 10 years of silence has a volume of its own when you finally stop maintaining it, and the pressure of release takes forms you don't anticipate. He had come to work for Drummond in 1872 in New Mexico Territory, hired as a land clerk because he had clean handwriting and a head for numbers and no particular prospects otherwise. He had been 30 years old and the job had seemed like a job, which was all he had wanted it to be. The first time he understood the full scope of what Drummond was doing, he had been in the records room when the forger Cull came in to deliver a set of completed documents, and something about the way Cull handled the paper carefully, with the specific self-consciousness of a man who knew the thing he was touching was not what it claimed to be, had made Jasper look more closely than he had been looking. He had started keeping his own records that week, not because he had a plan, because knowing something without writing it down felt to him like not quite knowing it, and he wanted to know completely what he was inside of. By the time he understood that what he was inside of was a systematic land theft operation that moved across county lines specifically to avoid concentrated attention from any single law enforcement authority, he was in deep enough that the easiest path out was the one that kept him in, and he was afraid. That was the honest part. He had been genuinely afraid in a way that kept revising its own rationale every time he tried to examine it from a direction that might have led to action. Nora listened to all of this without interrupting. Wren rode behind them both and let Jasper talk because a man talking is a man processing, and Jasper needed to arrive in Sable Ridge with his account organized and his commitment solid, and the riding and the talking were doing that work better than anything she might have said. When Jasper went quiet, Nora said, "What's in the ledger that isn't in the public land records?" Cull's real name. Jasper's hands were steady on his reins now, steadier than they'd been in the house. The name of the notary, which is also not the name on the stamp. The amounts Drummond paid for each forgery, which links his financial records to the dates of the transfers. And a pause. Correspondence. Letters. Between Drummond and a lawyer in Denver who reviewed the instruments before each transaction to ensure they'd survive legal challenge. The lawyer doesn't know the instruments are forged, but the letters document that Drummond knew his notary wasn't legitimate and used him anyway, which establishes intent at a level that makes the whole structure. He gestured briefly. Untenable. Nora said 12 properties, including 3 where the original owners died shortly after the transfer. Not from natural causes, Drummond's records suggest. He said it without inflection, which was more disturbing than if he'd said it with horror. I didn't know about those until I read back through the records 2 years ago. By then He stopped, started again. There are things I can't undo, but I can stop more from happening. The trail ahead opened up onto the wider plateau, and the last of the afternoon light turned the red rock formations bronze, and the shadows in the arroyos deep blue, and the 3 horses moved through it at a steady pace that felt to Wren like the landscape itself was finally oriented in the right direction. They made camp earlier than Wren would have chosen, because Jasper was 70 and had been through a frightening morning, and the horses needed rest, and because the ridge camp Wren had used the night before was defensible in a way the open trail was not. They ate from Nora's provisions, dried meat and hardtack and more of Wren's trail coffee, and Jasper held his tin cup in both hands and looked at the fire and said, without looking up, "I heard about what happened on Main Street, the deputy and the widow." Nora didn't confirm or deny it. She was reorganizing the saddlebag by firelight, with the methodical attention of someone who needed to put her hands on a physical task. "Was that you?" Jasper looked at Wren. "It was both of us." Wren looked at her coffee. "One of us had the rope cut. The other had 47 people watching. Did any of them?" "No." Jasper looked at Nora. "I'm sorry. For that too." Nora set the saddlebag down, looked at the fire for a moment. Then, with the flatness of someone who has looked directly at a thing and is describing what they see without embellishment, "The hard part isn't that they watched. People watch. Fear makes watchers of most people most of the time. That's not remarkable." She paused. "The hard part is that they knew me. 30 years in that county. They knew Frank and they knew me and they watched anyway." Another pause shorter. "That's what Drummond actually sells. Not fear. Certainty. He makes people certain that the cost of acting is higher than the cost of watching. and he's usually right because he's built the system so that it is. She looked at Jasper. Except when someone arrives who's already paid the cost. The fire moved in the cold air. Jasper said quietly, "You're talking about her." Nora looked at Wren. "I'm talking about both of us." Something in her voice shifted by a fraction of a degree. Turns out the cost of watching is not actually lower than the cost of acting. It just bills you later. Wren looked at the fire and thought about Durango and about all the years between Durango and this fire on this ridge and whether those years added up to something or just to distance. She thought they added up to something. She thought that was probably a recent development. They kept 2-hour watches. Wren first and Nora second, and Jasper exempt because he was 70 and had already done his hardest work of the decade today. Wren's watch was uneventful. The plateau cold and quiet, stars going edge to edge overhead in the way they only do at altitude. She woke Nora at the 2-hour mark, and Nora came alert in the same way she always did, all at once, fully, without transition, and took the watch without comment. Wren slept. When she woke, the sky was going gray and Nora had coffee on the coals and Jasper was already up and brushing his horse with the slow, careful movements of an old man who was still committing to the work in front of him. They rode into the second day. The trail south was longer through their chosen canyon route but safer, and they moved without hurrying because hurrying invited mistakes and what they were carrying was not something that could sustain mistakes. The ledger was in Nora's saddlebag, wrapped in its cloth riding against her left hip. Wren had not touched it and didn't need to. Its contents were not the question anymore. The question was Sable Ridge. Specifically, what Drummond had done with the 20 hours since his men had left for Millhaven. Wren had been building that model in the background of everything else she'd been doing, the way you solve a problem while your hands are busy with a different one. Drummond would know his men had failed by early afternoon the previous day, when they didn't return at the expected time. He would know Jasper was coming. He would know the ledger was coming. He would adjust. The question was how he adjusted. There were 2 directions. 1. He doubled down on public authority. He leaned harder on Hale. He leaned hard and pressed the claim through official channels fast enough to transfer the Calloway property before the ledger could be presented in any legal forum. This option required the legal machinery to move faster than human testimony could slow it, which was possible but not guaranteed. 2. He went the other direction. Made the problem disappear before it arrived at a courthouse. This option was more direct and carried significantly more risk, because the kind of disappearance Drummond had been skilled at for 20 years was the disappearance of paper and signatures and leveraged mortgages, not the disappearance of 3 people on a visible trail with a public witness trail behind them. But desperate men chose the option that felt fastest. And Drummond was not yet desperate, but he was adjacent to it, in a way he probably hadn't been since New Mexico Territory. And adjacent to desperation was a place where fast and foolish could become the same choice. They came off the canyon route onto the main southern trail, 4 miles north of Sable Ridge in the early afternoon. The last stretch of the approach was open country, no cover, visible from the ridge above town in both directions. Wren looked at the ridge for a long moment, nothing on the ridgeline, which was the correct number of things to see there if Drummond's men were positioned below the ridge rather than on it, watching from ground level. She kept her hand near her holster. The outskirts of Sable Ridge appeared ahead of them, the mill chimney, the church steeple, the roof lines of the main street. A town that looked exactly like it had looked every other day of its existence, which told you nothing about what was inside it. Nora was riding with her chin up and her eyes forward. She had not looked at Wren in the last mile. She was looking at Sable Ridge the way you look at a thing you're not sure is still yours, but intend to walk toward anyway. Whatever happens in there, Nora said, to the town ahead of her, to herself, to the afternoon air, this ends today. Wren looked at the main street visible at the end of the approach road, at the people moving on the boardwalks, ordinary midday motion, at the land office at the far end where Drummond's curtains were drawn against the afternoon light. She looked at Nora beside her, straight-backed and marked and moving forward. She looked at Jasper on Nora's other side, an old man with 10 years of records and 10 years of silence coming to the end of both simultaneously, and the specific look on his face of someone who has decided the thing completely enough, that fear has been reclassified as whether present, real, something you ride through rather than something that stops you. It ends today, Wren said. Not to encourage her, not to agree for the sake of agreeing, because it was the accurate statement of the situation. They rode into Sable Ridge. The first person to see them was the blacksmith, standing in his doorway in his leather apron with a hammer in his hand, and he watched the 3 horses come up the main approach road, and his face did something complicated, and then did something simpler and cleaner than what had been on it yesterday. The second person was the woman in the calico dress, the one who had stood at the edge of the boardwalk yesterday longer than anyone else before going back inside. She was coming out of the dry goods store, and she stopped and looked at Nora on her horse, and then at Jasper, and then at the saddlebag on Nora's left hip, as though she knew by some instinct what was in it and what it meant. The third person was Hector, in the doorway of the Dusty Boot, wiping down a glass. He looked at them come in and nodded once at Nora, which was his version of an eloquent speech. Drummond's office curtains did not move. They tied up at the rail in front of the saloon. Wren checked the street both directions without obviously checking the street both directions, which was a skill like any other. 3 of Drummond's men visible, positioned at intervals along the main street, not doing anything, just present. Drummond's version of a reminder that he still held the geography. Nora came around to Wren's side of the horses. Quietly, so only Wren heard. He's going to make his move before we can get Jasper in front of anyone official. I know, we need people on the street, not just inside buildings. Nora looked at the dry goods doorway where the woman in the calico dress had gone back inside. We need them where Drummond has to see them. Wren thought about what it took to get 47 people off a boardwalk. Not fear, they were already afraid. Not logic, they'd had logic available to them for 2 years. Something else. Something that could only be delivered by a specific kind of witness. She looked at Jasper, who was still on his horse at the rail, looking at the town around him with the careful, steady eyes of someone who has come a long way and is taking the last few steps. Jasper. Wren looked up at him. Before we go inside anywhere, before the land office or the sheriff or any official room, I need you to stand in the street. Jasper looked down at her. Not to speak yet, not to read from the ledger, just to stand in the street where they can see you, where Drummond can see you. She held his gaze because he spent 10 years knowing you exist and believing you'd never come here, and I need him to see that you did. Jasper sat with that for a moment. Then he dismounted, slowly, with the deliberateness of age, both feet on the Sable Ridge dirt. He straightened his coat, settled his hat, looked at Main Street spread out before him. The curtain in Drummond's land office moved 1 inch and went still. He'd seen. Nora stepped up beside Jasper, on his other side. The 3 of them stood at the rail in front of the Dusty Boot and looked down Main Street, and Main Street looked back, and something in the air of Sable Ridge shifted by a fraction of a degree that was not meteorological. The woman in the calico dress came back out of the dry goods store. She stood on the boardwalk and did not go back inside. The blacksmith stepped out of his doorway and stood on the street. A man Wren didn't know came out of the feed depot and stopped, looking. Jim Bowden came around the corner from the side street and saw Nora standing at the rail and stopped walking, and then started walking again toward her, and kept coming until he was 20 feet away, and then stopped again and stood. Drummond's office curtain moved a second time. This was the moment before the moment. This was the inhale. The thing that happens in the 2 seconds before the thing that everyone will remember happens, when the shape of what is coming is already visible to anyone paying attention, and everyone is paying attention, and the shape of it is larger than Silas Drummond's land office curtain and his 3 positioned men and the manufactured certainty he had sold this town for 2 years. Nora looked at Wren. Wren looked at the office curtain, still now, and at the 3 men on the street who had started to look at each other the way people look at each other when the position they've been assigned is revealing itself as untenable, and at Jim Bowden standing 20 feet away with his hat in his hands. She looked at Jasper, who was standing in the Sable Ridge dirt with his ledger in Nora's saddlebag, and 10 years of accumulated silence at his back and his face pointed forward. She looked at Nora. Tomorrow morning, Wren said. Public. Main Street. Not inside any room he controls, Nora. He'll try to stop it tonight. He'll try. Wren looked at the land office. Let him try. The afternoon sun hit the main street of Sable Ridge, at the angle it hit it every October afternoon, indifferent and precise. And the shadows it threw were long and They reached all the way from the boardwalk posts to the center of the street, and in those shadows the town was already choosing something, one person at a time, without quite having said so yet. Inside the land office, behind the curtain, Silas Drummond would be doing what he always did when a situation began revising itself against his calculations. He would be finding the instrument closest to hand and applying maximum pressure to the point of greatest leverage. He had done it in New Mexico territory. He had done it in 3 counties before that. He was a man of reliable methods. But his methods required a certain specific ingredient. They required the people around him to continue believing, moment to moment, that the cost of standing up was higher than the cost of staying seated. And that ingredient, on that afternoon on Main Street in Sable Ridge, Colorado territory, in the autumn of 1882, was becoming less available to him by the minute. Wren felt it, not with triumph, with the careful recognition of someone who has learned that the moment before a thing resolves is the most dangerous moment of all, because it is the moment when the losing party makes its most desperate decision. She kept her hand near her holster and watched the door of the land office and waited for what came next. Drummond moved that night. He had given 2 days. He used one, not with subtlety. Subtlety had been the instrument of the previous 2 years, and subtlety required time and patience and the cooperation of a system he was no longer certain he controlled. What he reached for instead was directness, the blunt tool of a man whose preferred architecture had developed visible cracks and whose timeline had compressed past the point where elegant solutions remained available. At 10:30, 2 of his men came to the Dusty Boot and told Hector to close up. Hector told them, with the economy of a man who had been running a saloon for 22 years and had navigated most categories of human difficulty, that his closing time was his business and theirs was the door. One of the men put his hand on the bar. Hector put a shotgun on the bar. The men left. This was not a victory for anyone. It was the opening move of a night that had not yet declared its full intention. Wren had seen them coming from the window of the room above the saloon that Hector had given her without being asked. She watched them cross the street and return to the land office, and she watched the light in Drummond's upper window stay on past midnight, and she sat in the chair by the window in her flancel shirt and her denim with her boots still on and her revolver on the table beside her, and she did not sleep. Before coming upstairs, she had done one other thing. She had given Hector the summary document she had written out by hand during the 2 hours. Jasper spent settling into his room a condensed account of the ledger's contents. Property names, dates, the forger's name, the false notary, and she had asked him to put it in the hands of the morning mail rider at first light. Hector had taken the folded papers without reading them and put them inside his coat and said he knew the rider personally, and the rider owed him a considerable favor, and the document would be on its way to the Federal Circuit office in Denver before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. That was the thing about Hector. He understood the weight of a task without needing it explained twice. Nora was in the room next door. Jasper was down the hall, and Wren had checked the lock on his door twice before she settled into her chair, and checked it once more at 11 when she heard him cough, and then heard the particular silence of a man reminding himself to be quiet in an unfamiliar place. The ledger itself was not in any of their rooms. It was somewhere in Hector's building that was not the saloon, and the only person who knew exactly where was Hector, and Hector's relationship with Drummond had clarified itself over the past 48 hours, in ways that made him the most reliable safe in Sable Ridge. At 1 in the morning, something struck the side of the building. Not hard enough to be a structural assault, hard enough to be a message. Wren was at the window before the sound finished, looking down at the street. 2 men below, moving fast into the cross-street shadow. She tracked them until they disappeared, and then scanned the rest of the visible and found the rest of the visible street, found it felt arranged rather than natural. She went to Nora's room, knocked twice in the pattern they had agreed on. The door opened immediately, which confirmed what Wren had suspected. The sleep had been real, but the awareness beneath it had been running the whole time. The way a good cattle dog rests near the herd with one ear always turned toward the dark. Nora stood in the doorway fully dressed, boots on, silver hair pinned tight, revolver in hand. She looked at Wren with the alert readiness of someone who has been waiting for a situation to declare itself and is relieved it finally has. because waiting without information is harder than responding to something real. 2 men moved off to the cross street. Wren kept her voice below the level the walls would carry, testing to see who responds and how fast. He wants to know if we're watching. Now he knows. Wren looked down the hall toward Jasper's door, still behind it, either asleep against all probability or very still. He won't come at the building directly. Too many people saw us ride in. Whatever he does tonight, he needs it to look like something other than what it is. Nora said, the ranch. Wren had been building that same model since they'd ridden in. Pete's out there alone. Pete's been out there alone before. Something moved behind Nora's eyes that was not as settled as her voice. Pete Garner had worked the Calloway Ranch for 11 years. He was 60 years old and loyal, in the way that never needed to be stated, because it was visible in every decision he made, including the decision he had made yesterday when Drummond's men came back up the drive, and he had stood between them and the house anyway. He was alone on 3,000 acres of dark Colorado night with a man who had demonstrated, in county after county, a practiced familiarity with pressure that left no traceable signature. I'll go. Wren was already moving back toward her room for her coat. You stay with Jasper. Get him to the street at 9. Whatever happens between now and then, get him there. Nora's hand caught her arm. Not hard. Just present, the way a fact is present. Wren stopped and looked back at her. Be careful. Nora said it the way she said everything without the softening agents people usually wrapped around things that mattered to them. Just the words themselves, stripped to their actual meaning. Wren held her gaze for a moment. Then, I'll be back before 8. She took the roan out of Hector's side stable at 1:15, moving quietly in the dark. The horse knew night work and did not object to it. She rode north on the creek road rather than the main approach, which added a quarter mile and removed her from the sightline of Drummond's upper window. The ride to the Calloway Ranch took 20 minutes at a canter in the dark. The moon was 2 days past full, enough to read the trail without announcing herself on the open ground. She slowed to a walk at the ranch gate and came in along the fence line. The bunkhouse light was on. She tied the roan to the fence rather than the rail and went to the bunkhouse on foot and knocked twice. A pause. Then Pete's voice, rough but alert. Who is it? Wren Daly. I came with Mrs. Calloway. The door opened. Pete Garner in the lamplight had the look of a man who had not been sleeping, still in his work clothes, the bruising from the previous day gone to deep color along his jaw. He looked at Wren, then at the dark yard behind her, then back at her. Anyone come out here tonight? Hour ago. 2 men rode up the drive, stopped at the gate, looked at the house, left. His voice was level. Didn't come in. Same pattern they ran on the saloon. Wren looked past him at the rifle on the table. They're measuring what pushes back and what doesn't. I pushed back. He said it without decoration. I know you did. She looked at him directly. In the morning I need you to do something. Not dangerous. Strategic. Pete waited with the patience of a man who had been doing strategic things in service of the Calloway Ranch for years without using that word for them. At 9 o'clock something is going to happen on Main Street. I need you there, standing. Not armed, not confrontational. Just one more person who can't be bought and isn't leaving. She paused. Every person who stands up makes the next person more likely to. That's the whole ask. Pete considered this with the care it deserved. Mrs. Calloway going to be all right? Not a question. A statement presented for confirmation. If everything goes the way I'm planning it, Wren said. And if it doesn't, she looked at him steadily. Then I need you there more, not less. Pete picked up his coat from the hook behind the door. 8:30, he said. She rode back to Sable Ridge in the last of the dark, arriving at the stable before 3:30. The street was quiet. Drummond's office window was dark. She put the roan up, went to her room, moved the chair back to the window, and sat in it until the sky began to change. At 6 she heard Nora moving in the next room. At 6:15 she heard Jasper in the hall. She went downstairs where Hector already had coffee on and eggs in the pan, and she sat at the counter and ate with the focus of someone fueling a machine that needed to perform today. And when Nora came down at 6:30 she ate the same way. And when Jasper came down at 6:45, he accepted the coffee and declined the eggs, sat looking at the surface of his cup, and none of them said much because the morning had enough weight in it already, without adding words to the load. Outside, Sable Ridge was conducting its ordinary business. The stamp mill on the ridge, the blacksmith's fire, the dry goods opening its shutters. Wren watched the land office from the saloon window, curtains still drawn, No movement. Drummond's men from the previous day were not at their positions yet, which told her either they'd been stood down or repositioned somewhere she couldn't see, and neither interpretation was more comfortable than the other. At 7:30 she went to find Cord Hale. She went alone. What she needed to do with Hale required a privacy that an audience would complicate, and she needed it done before the street filled up. She pushed through the sheriff's office door without knocking, because knocking gave a man time to put on a posture, and she needed to see the face he was actually wearing. He was at his desk, jacket on, badge visible on the vest, coffee cooling in his hand, the look of a man who had not slept and had spent the night arriving somewhere he hadn't chosen to go. He looked up at Wren when she came in, and his expression went carefully neutral. Wren closed the door, stayed standing. Drummond sent men to the saloon last night, and to the Calloway ranch. He's going to make his move this morning before Jasper Oakes can establish himself on public record. He'll tell you the property transfer is complete and try to use your office to enforce it. Hale set the coffee down, looked at his hands. When that request comes, Wren said, you'll have a decision to make. Not the first one you've made for him, the last. She let that land without commentary. What I'm telling you is that a summary of Jasper's ledger is already on its way to the Federal Circuit office in Denver on this morning's mail rider. The original is secured somewhere in this town that Drummond hasn't identified and won't in time. Whatever he's offering you to hold your position, the position is already gone. The question is whether you leave it on your own terms, or whether it leaves you. Hale was quiet. He looked at the badge on his vest, the way a man looks at something he has been wearing so long. He stopped feeling its weight, and has just now felt it again. I've got a mortgage on my house, he said. Drummond's been holding it 3 years. I know. That was how it started. He looked up. Not why it continued, but how it started. I'm not here to argue the starting point. Wren held his gaze without softening it. I'm asking what happens this morning. The stamp mill counted seconds on the ridge. What do you need from me? His voice had changed by a quality that was not dramatic but was real. Be on Main Street at 9. Stand where it matters. When Drummond moves, don't move with him. She went to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. You don't have to be something you haven't been. You just have to stop being useful to him. That's the whole distance. She walked back to the saloon in the growing morning light. At 8:30, Pete Garner tied his horse at the rail in front of the blacksmith's shop. The blacksmith had been standing in his doorway since 8 o'clock without any particular stated reason, in his leather apron, hammer hanging from his right hand. Pete took a position beside him, and they stood together the way men stand when they have arrived somewhere early and intend to stay. At 8:45, the woman in the calico dress came out of the dry goods store and stood on the boardwalk. She had come out and gone back in 3 times in the past 2 days. This time she did not go back. At 8:50, Jim Bowden came up the main approach road on foot. He stopped at the near edge of Main Street, looked at the land office, looked at the people already on the boards and the ground, then crossed and stood 15 feet from Pete and said nothing to anyone. His hat was in his hands. He was a man arriving somewhere he should have arrived sooner, and knowing it, and doing it anyway, and the doing was what mattered now, regardless of the late hour of it. At 8:55, Nora came out of the dusty boot. She wore her dark wool-divided riding skirt and her white linen blouse, both clean, and her worn leather boots, and her work hat tied down. She had dressed carefully that morning, not for ceremony, but for the opposite of ceremony, to look like exactly what she was, which was a woman who had built something real over 30 years and was standing in front of it. The marks on her wrists were visible below her cuffs. She had not covered them, not as a performance. As a fact, she had decided not to hide. She stood on the saloon boardwalk and looked down Main Street with the patience of someone who has been moving toward this exact point for 4 days and is not going to contaminate the arrival with hurry. Wren came out beside her. Then Jasper, careful on the step, his hat on, his coat straight, carrying the look of a man who has traveled a long distance to arrive at something he has been circling for 10 years and has finally stopped circling. The land office door opened at exactly 9 o'clock. Drummond came out alone. No hired men flanking him. He had made a calculation about optics, and the calculation was that armed men at his side would signal uncertainty, and uncertainty was the one thing he had never allowed this town to see in him. His black coat was on, his vest straight, the watch chain in place. He looked at the street the way he had always looked at it, with the quiet confidence of a man taking inventory of what he owned. He looked at Pete and the blacksmith, at Jim Bowden, at the woman in calico, at the three families who had come up from the far end of the street in the last few minutes, people Wren hadn't seen before, drawn by the specific gravity of something real happening in public, at the man from the stamp mill who had apparently decided the mill could run without him, at Cord Hale standing at the entrance to his office on the cross street with his badge catching the morning light. He looked at Nora on the saloon boardwalk, and at Wren beside her, and at Jasper Oakes. Something crossed his face. Not fear, not yet, revision. The expression of a man who has run the same model many times and is now finding the outputs different and is checking his inputs for error. He walked to the center of the street, stopped, looked at Jasper across the distance between them. Mr. Oakes. His voice, what it always was, measured, carrying without effort. I'll admit you're the last person I expected to see in this town. Jasper took one step forward off the saloon boardwalk, one step onto the red earth of Main Street. His hat was in his hands. He looked at Drummond with the steadiness of a man who has finally put down something he has been carrying too long and found that his hands, freed of it, are more reliable than he remembered. I imagine you are, Jasper said, clean and true. Drummond looked at the people gathering on both sides of the street. He was counting, and he was recalculating, and the recalculation was not going in the direction he needed it to go. Whatever this man has told you, he said to the street at large, the reasonable voice of a reasonable man making a reasonable point. Jasper Oakes worked for me for 4 years, and left my employ under circumstances that reflect poorly on his character. Any records he claims to possess. The mail rider left for Denver at first light this morning. Wren's voice cut through the sentence without raising in pitch. He's carrying a summary of the ledger's contents. Property names, dates, amounts, the name of the man who made the forged signatures, the name of the false notary, and documentation of correspondence between you and a Denver attorney whose involvement you deliberately withheld from him. She looked at Drummond across the morning air of Main Street. The original ledger is already secured somewhere in this town. You haven't found it, and you won't before the federal examiner arrives. She let that settle for one full breath. Whatever you're planning to do in the next 10 minutes, I'd think hard about whether it helps you or finishes you. Drummond's eyes moved. Not to Wren, to Jasper. The look of a man searching for the thing that can still be pulled, the lever, the remaining pressure point. He found nothing in Jasper's face that offered him one. He looked at Deputy Vane at the edge of the street. Deputy. The Calloway property transfer is recorded as of this morning. I need you too. The Calloway transfer is suspended pending investigation of fraud. Cord Hale walked from the cross street onto Main Street. He walked at the pace of a man who has made his decision completely, and is not rushing toward it or away from it. His voice was not entirely steady, but it was loud enough for the street to hear, and the street heard it. Silas Drummond, you're under arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy to deprive landholders of their property through falsified instruments. He stopped 2 feet from Drummond and took the handcuffs from his belt. Put your hands out. Drummond looked at the cuffs, looked at the street, at Pete and the blacksmith on his left, at Jim Bowden, at the families who had come forward from the far end, at Jasper Oakes standing in the Colorado sun with his hat in his hands, and his 10 years of records and his 10 years of silence both at their ends simultaneously, at Nora Calloway on the saloon boardwalk, who was looking at him the way she had looked at his forged document on her kitchen table 4 days ago, without flinching and without requiring him to be anything other than exactly what he was. He put his hands out. The iron closed around his wrists, and the sound of it went down Main Street to both ends. And if the street had been a held breath, it released now, not with the dramatic exhale of a story engineered for maximum effect, but with the quieter and more human sound of a group of people, updating their understanding of what kind of place they lived in, and what they had, in the past 4 days and the past 2 years, either done or failed to do. Rex Vane stood at the edge of the street for a moment. Then he unhooked his holster belt and set it on the boardwalk post beside him. He walked away toward the livery and did not come back, and that was the most articulate thing he had said in the entire duration of his employment. The woman in the calico dress came down from the boardwalk and walked to Nora and took both her hands in her own, looking at the marks on Nora's wrists and then up at Nora's face, and she said something too low for the street to hear, and Nora received it without deflecting it. The blacksmith crossed to where Jasper was standing and put out his hand, and Jasper looked at it for a moment and then shook it, and the blacksmith said nothing, because nothing was the correct thing to say, and he knew it. Jim Bowden came across the street to where Nora was standing. He held his hat. He was a man who had made a specific choice 4 days ago, that he was now standing inside the consequence of, and he knew it, and he did not try to manage the knowing with excessive language. "I'm sorry, Nora," he said. Just that. The full weight of it on 2 words and her first name, which he had not used when he closed the door on her. Nora looked at him for a long moment, a moment long enough that it was not comfortable, which was the appropriate length for it. "I know you have a family, Jim," she said, "but the next time someone needs a door opened, I expect you to open it. No performance of forgiveness, no lecture, just the boundary drawn clearly, which was worth more than a speech and harder to forget." Jim Bowden nodded once, and put his hat back on and stepped back, and there was something in his face that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who has been told an honest thing by someone who had every right to tell him worse. Wren stood 2 steps behind Nora, and watched the street settle into its new configuration, and she let herself feel, for the first time in 4 days, the release of tension that had been holding every decision in her body at operating pressure since the moment she'd ridden into Sable Ridge. Not triumph, not the theatrical satisfaction of a story landing its ending. Something more like the sensation of a thing that has been wrong for a very long time returning to its correct position. The way ground sounds when the fence wire finally goes taut. Hector came out of the dusty boot with his hands in his apron, and stood on the boardwalk and watched Drummond being walked to the sheriff's office. He looked at Wren when she turned, and he gave the small nod of a man who has done what he was asked and found it sufficient. Jasper Oaks was still in the center of Main Street. A woman Wren didn't recognize was talking to him. His hat was back on his head, and his hands had stopped shaking, or were shaking less, and his face had the look of a man who has set down a weight he has been repositioning for 10 years, without ever quite putting it on the ground, and has finally put it on the ground, and is feeling the absence of it in his shoulders. Nora turned from the place where Drummond had been standing and found Wren. She walked to her. They stood in the October sun, while the street moved around them, and Nora looked at Wren's face with the same attention she applied to everything, and what she found there she held without commentary for a moment. Then, "You never told me the name of your father's ranch." Wren looked at the corner of the street where Drummond's land office curtains hung still over empty rooms. The Daly place, outside Durango, 300 acres with good grass along the creek. A beat, it was good land. Nora held her gaze. It still is. At Wren's expression, land doesn't become less than what it was because a piece of paper said something false about it. The creek is still running, the grass is still growing. She paused. "Your father is still there." Wren looked at the ground for a moment. The earth of Sable Ridge, red and hard and cold in October, the same kind of ground that went for miles in every direction, and had been there before any of this, and would be there after. She thought about Durango and about the distance between 14 and 24, and whether that distance added up to something, or just to years. She thought it added up to something. She thought that was a recent conclusion. "The ranch will need people this winter," Nora said. Not a pivot. An extension of the same thought connected the way her thoughts always connected, without decorative transition. The hands left when Drummond made his position known. "Pete can't work the full property alone through the cold months." Wren looked at her. "Are you asking me to stay? I'm observing a staffing requirement." Nora's mouth moved at the corner in a way that changed her face. Small, brief. The first time Wren had seen it, and it rearranged something in the arithmetic she had been doing without deciding to do it. "The interpretation is yours." "I don't know how to want one place," Wren said. Not a refusal. An honest disclosure of the thing that had been true about her for 10 years. Nora looked at the ranch road at the north end of town. "Frank didn't either. He was passing through when we met. He told me later that the land made better arguments than he did." She looked back at Wren. "He stayed 30 years. Wren looked at the north road, at the country beyond it, the mesa going red gold under the October sun, the rim rock throwing long shadows east, the kind of light that existed in this specific latitude and altitude, and nowhere she had ridden in 10 years that was quite the same. She had been noticing that light since her second day in Sable Ridge, without deciding to notice it. Through the winter, she said. Nora nodded once. The same nod she had given in the canyon camp when Wren said she'd be back before 8. The nod of a woman who understands that through the winter is where everything real has always started. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm, distinct from the compressed urgency of the previous 4 days. A federal examiner arrived from Denver 17 days after the arrest. A precise man in a gray coat who spent 4 days in the land records office with Jasper's ledger and emerged with documentation sufficient to support charges that would be heard in the territorial court the following spring. 3 properties were ordered returned to their original holders or surviving family. The Calloway debt instrument was voided in the first week. The forged signature confirmed in writing by a documents examiner whose 14-page opinion left no interpretive space. Cord Hale resigned the sheriff's position 3 days after the arrest, before anyone asked him to. He left the badge on the county clerk's desk, not Nora's table, not Wren's hand on the desk of the office itself, which was where it belonged, and walked out of Sable Ridge on a westbound road. Wren thought about that sometimes without judgment and without its absence. Rex Vane had left the county before the examiner arrived and did not return. Jasper Oaks did not go back to Millhaven. He accepted the offer of the cabin by the creek on Calloway land before the examiner finished his second day, and he spent the first week making it habitable with the thoroughness of a man who intends the habitation to last, repairing the window frame, the gap in the south wall, the step on the porch, and when the carpentry was done, he started organizing Nora's accounts, which had fallen behind in the chaos of October, and found that he was good at it in a way that had nothing to do with anything Drummond had ever asked him to do, which made it particularly satisfying. The winter was hard in the way Colorado winters are hard, which is completely and without apology and without any interest in your opinion of its severity. Wren had worked hard winters before, in the Panhandle and in the high country of New Mexico Territory, and she worked this one the same way methodically. Attention on the task at hand, not the temperature. She and Pete developed the functional shorthand of 2 people, working the same ground toward the same purpose, a language built from gestures and brief directives, and the kind of silence that is not empty, but efficient. He showed her the winter pasture topography, the fence, lines that needed watching, the natural breaks, where the cattle found shelter when the north wind came in wrong. She showed him 3 rope techniques she had learned working cattle in the Panhandle that were faster than what he was using. They worked well together without making anything of it, which was the best kind of working well together. Nora ran the ranch through the cold months the way she had always run it, with the knowledge that every winter decision had a spring consequence, and was therefore not a seasonal calculation, but a continuous one. She was also corresponding with 2 families, whose properties had been caught in Drummond's claim, one of whom was still in the territory and needed help navigating the legal recovery. And she gave that help the way she gave everything directly, specifically, without managing the recipient's experience of receiving it. Wade Calloway arrived in February. No relation to Frank that Nora had ever been able to trace, which was the kind of coincidence the frontier produced regularly, given the limited pool of surnames that had made the westward crossing. He was 34 years old, wide through the shoulder, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who had been doing physical work for long enough that his body had organized itself around it. He had been foreman of the Hartley operation 2 Valleys East for 5 years, and the Hartley operation had sold in the fall to a cattle company that preferred its own management, and he had heard through the network of ranching information that moved across the territory on the frequency of seasonal workers and passing riders, that the Calloway Ranch was rebuilding its crew and that Nora Calloway ran a straight operation and was a fair employer. He rode up the drive on a Monday morning in a heavy canvas work coat over his flannel shirt, his wide-brimmed hat pulled against the February wind, and tied his horse at the rail and knocked and stated his business plainly, and Nora hired him for the spring season and showed him the second bunk in the hands cabin, and that was that. Except that Wren had been in the yard working the winter coat out of the roan with a curry brush when Wade Calloway came up the drive, and she had looked up at him, and he had looked at her, and the exchange of that look lasted 2 seconds and was filed by her brain under a category she had not expected to have occasion to use. He was not remarkable in the way of people remarkable in the way of people who needed to be remarkable to hold attention. He was remarkable in a different and less common way. He looked at the thing in front of him, as though it was actually the thing in front of him, with full and unperformed attention, which Wren had learned over a decade of observing men across a range of circumstances, was rarer than it had any right to be. She went back to currying the roan. He went to find Pete. The morning continued in its direction. But the morning had acquired something it had not had before he came up the drive, and she acknowledged this to herself at the end of the day, with the same honesty she applied to everything she acknowledged to herself, which meant without embellishment and without avoidance. The spring court session in Denver resolved in the way Jasper's documentation made inevitable. Drummond received a sentence that the territorial papers described in measured legal language that did not approach the weight of what he had actually done, which was the way of courts. But the sentence was real, and the record was real, and the properties returned to their holders were real, and real was what mattered on the ground where people had to live, and the ground was where Wren was living now. She noticed this in the way you notice something that has been true for a while before you put language to it. She was not moving through Sable Ridge on her way to somewhere else. She was waking up in the same place she had gone to sleep, and the place was Calloway land, and the work waiting for her in the morning was work she had learned the specific requirements of, and was becoming efficient at, and the people she was working alongside were people whose habits and capabilities and limitations she knew, and who knew hers.
She had never lived this way before.
Not since she was 14, and living this way was simply called home, and she had not yet learned what its loss felt like from the inside. In late May, she was sitting on the south pasture fence at the end of a long day, with the sunset going gold over the western ridge, when Wade Calloway sat down on the fence beside her, 12 inches away. They had been working the same ground for 3 months, and had the easy wordlessness of people who have covered the necessary talking and moved into the territory past it. They sat for a while in that wordlessness and watched the light change on the mesa. He said, looking at the sunset, "You thinking about leaving when the season's done?" Wren considered the question with the care it deserved, which was considerable. She had been considering it at intervals since February, running it alongside other calculations, the way a navigational problem runs below the surface of the active work. "I told Mrs. Calloway through the winter," she said. "Winter's been over 6 weeks." She looked at him. He was still watching the sunset, patient in the way of a man who has asked what he needed to ask and has no investment in crowding the answer toward a particular shape. "I don't know how to want one place," she said. Same honest disclosure she had made to Nora in October. But the weight of it was different now, not heavier, more specific, more located. He looked at her then. "Neither did I." He looked back at the ridge. "Still don't, some days. But when I do, it's here." Wren looked at the south pasture green in the evening light, the cattle moving slowly on the far slope, the creek sound coming up from below the hill, the ranch house where the kitchen lamp had come on, which was where Nora would be at this hour. She looked at the country around Sable Ridge, spread out to the ridgeline, that Colorado evening light she had been registering without commentary since her second day in the valley, and had never once stopped noticing. She looked at Wade Calloway 12 inches away. "I'll stay through the summer," she said. Something in his face settled, not performed. Just the sensation of a thing returning to where it was supposed to be. Through the summer became through the fall, in the way that honest things accumulate when the ground beneath them is solid. In the kitchen on an October morning, exactly 1 year after Wren had ridden down Main Street and said 2 words that changed the shape of everything that followed, Nora Calloway was at the table with her mending and her coffee. Wren came in from the yard, poured a cup, stood at the counter for a moment, then sat down across from Nora. She held the cup in both hands and looked at it, and was quiet in the way people are quiet before they say the thing they have come in from the yard to say. Nora set down her mending. She looked at Wren across the kitchen table, not with surprise, with the attention of a woman who sees what is in front of her and does not require the presentation of it to be managed for her benefit. "I know," Nora said. Wren looked up. "How long?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. Nora picked the mending back up because her hands needed to be doing something and Wren did not need ceremony. "You have the same look I had before I told Frank." She turned the work in her hands. He already knew. He just waited for me to say it. Wren sat with that for a moment. "Wade knows." Nora made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Warm though." "Yes." Wren looked out the kitchen window at the Calloway ranch in October. the grass going bronze at the tips, the cattle moving unhurried on the south slope, Pete's lamp already on in the bunkhouse, the thin thread of smoke from Jasper's cabin chimney down by the creek. Wade was in the barn, and his voice came across the yard faintly through the open barn door, talking to one of the horses the way he did in the mornings, and the sound of it had become part of the morning the way the creek sound was part of the morning. Nora looked out the window too, at the ranch she and Frank had built across 28 winters, at the land that had nearly been taken by a piece of paper and had not been taken because two women had ridden toward each other across the distance between their different griefs and found they were aimed at the same thing. This child, Nora said, her voice the same voice she always used, plain and without decoration and carrying more than it showed, is going to grow up on land that was worth fighting for. She looked at Wren directly, and the look was the one she had always given full attention. Nothing managed or withheld. That's not luck. That's what you build when you build, without lying about what you're building. Wren looked at her across the kitchen table, at the silver hair, the work-ruined hands, the face that had looked at every hard thing in 4 days and in 30 years, with the same refusal to look away. She thought about a saloon on a Tuesday afternoon, and public land records laid on a table without explanation, and a woman who had said we ride at first light, as though it were the only logical sentence available. She thought it had been. Outside the window, the October morning was doing what October mornings did in the Colorado Territory, arriving clear and cold and indifferent and entirely beautiful, the light from the east coming in low and turning everything it touched to a color that had no name except itself. Jasper was walking up from the creek cabin for his morning coffee, as he did every day now. The blacksmith's shop was opening 5 miles south on Main Street in Sable Ridge. The families whose land had been returned were working theirs. The territorial court record was what it was. The forged papers were ash. The land remained. The creek ran. The grass would come back in the spring the way it always came back, reliable and unhurried, with no memory of the winter that had tried to stop it, and no particular interest in being thanked for surviving. Nora picked her mending back up. Wren drank her coffee. The morning continued in the direction mornings go when the ground beneath them is honest, which is forward, always forward, into whatever the next thing turns out to be.